Honey, I blew up the business.
Welcome to the podcast. Super excited today. We have the epic podcaster and exit guy in the house, Nick Bradley. Good to see you.
Dan, it is a pleasure. The exit guy podcaster. Yeah, there's been some journey to get to that. We can get into all of that today.
We're going to get into it because we have on the line today an entrepreneur, investor, author, speaker, and business growth expert. He's we'll get into his history in the dark side of private equity, but he's done multiple billion-dollar deals. He does lots of stuff. We'll get into it. But he's the host of the Scale Up with Nick Bradley podcast, which is excellent. I've got to recommend it. Full of hints, tips, his views, really interesting guests. People like Seth Godin and Dean Graziosi. It's ranked number 1 on iTunes' and Spotify's business charts. Check that out, you bastard.
Well, it was. It's funny. I used that as a bit of a claim to fame because it was there for months and months until Steven Bartlett decided to spend a lot of money, on his podcast.
Oh, I hate that guy.
We can say that, can't we? He even did a podcast where he actually says how he decided to take over everyone else's podcast, and he went and bought this massive table, like a boardroom table, a $50,000 set, so he could invite guests into his London palace. God, that's taking it to another level, right?
All I need is a big table and a London palace, and I'm sorted. So not that I'm bitter about people like you who've had the number 1 spot. I'm working towards it.
It doesn't mean anything, Dan. It's what I call a vanity metric. It was great at the time, and I can put it on my website and all that sort of thing. And it did, open up a few doors for me. But since then, you know what? It hasn't been that important.
Well, as regular listeners to this podcast will know, vanity metrics and external validation is what we're all about on this podcast.
Okay.
No, wait, no, we're not. We're not. Before we get into it, I just want to remind everybody that this podcast is brought to you by my company, The Tech Department. That's the one that I blew up. I made a real mess of it, but we did turn it around. And actually, we're 19 years old next year, and it's currently the best it's ever been. So we did turn it around.
There you go.
So I'm super happy with that. But I don't want to do that again, which is why Nick's going to tell me how to do it properly. And that's why I'm interviewing people on this podcast. They're going to get into it. And if you like that mission, because I'm trying to help you, the listener, and me, obviously not mess things up again. But if you like that mission, because we are trying to help entrepreneurs, please share the episode. Please share the podcast, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. 5-star reviews only. Don't be shortchanging us, because we need that 5-star review for that external validation, which we love. Let's get into it.
Lovely, Dan. Great intro. Perfect stuff.
I love it. You started your entrepreneurial journey in your late teens, I believe. You created your first business, but in your very own words, you quote, sabotaged it. Yes. What happened?
So it's funny, actually. The business was a personal training business, which, to do a time check here, we're talking late 80s, early 90s. Now, I look young, but I'm almost 50, right? And back then, if you had a personal trainer, this was in a place called Adelaide, South Australia, which we can talk about. It's a quirky place. If you had a personal trainer, you were pretty wealthy. You're either a doctor, a lawyer, a stockbroker, something like that. And so I was quite unique, right, to have this sort of private studio in a commercial gym, and I would have people come and pay me for one-to-one sessions. And then I built a small team. So I had it was 3 staff at the time. And it's all going really well. I was also studying at university, doing a business and marketing degree, and had this business, had a great car, had, all the stuff going on as a 19-year-old guy. And I decided to just crash it, to use your words, to blow it up intentionally. and it was funny. What actually happened was I wasn't surrounded growing up by anyone entrepreneurial. And one of the things I look back on now and reflect upon is environment is everything, right? Who you surround yourself with is everything in terms of where you take yourself to. You can't really grow if you're surrounded by people who are trying to pull you back in. And in that environment, no one knew any better. It wasn't a deliberate thing by my family, parents, grandparents, all that sort of stuff, but they saw entrepreneurship as risky. And the feedback that was drummed into me, both directly and indirectly, from years before and also when I had this business, was, when are you going to go do something properly? When are you going to go get a real job? This thing's going to fail. It won't work. What's a personal trainer? No one needs a personal trainer, right? Again, we're talking back in the early 90s. So I decided to sell the company. So my first exit, right, for 3,000 Australian dollars, right, 3,000 Australian dollars, was this really well set up little personal training studio in Adelaide, South Australia. And then I went off into the world of corporate private equity, et cetera, after that.
Wow. So, okay. So it's early 90s and you've got, so not only are you in a not even a proper job, it's an entrepreneurial job, which what's even that? You're in a sort of weird, ridiculous industry like private coaching people.
Yeah, personal training, personal fitness training. But, these days there's lots of personal trainers and it's not, uncommon. But back then it was almost like celebrity status stuff. Like my clients were off the charts type of people. But back then you just wouldn't see that as a business.
So you got yourself in a position where your first exit, your $3,000 exit back in your first venture, but you see that as sabotage. And I'm just curious because it's interesting, this sort of formative experience. So at the time when you were kind of in this environment which was not supportive of you, and perhaps you were getting these kind of like words of doubt around you, the kind of environment wasn't helping you. Can you, looking back now, because obviously you've gone through this experience and you are where you are now, and you're looking back at that time. What was going on in your mind, as you were sort of going into that? And when did you realize you'd sabotaged it?
I only realized I sabotaged it when I started my next venture, which was about 4 years ago. So I didn't know at the time. So here's the interesting thing. And I learned a lot through the journey, and all of it's really great, right? But like, in your story, when it happens at the time and different things are going on, you don't connect to that. So at the time, I felt that I needed to, this is the bit that's probably a little bit more subliminal. I decided to sell the business and leave the state, right? So I got in a car, my old Ford Laser, and I moved to Sydney and I worked for Rupert Murdoch. And that was my sort of foray into the corporate world. But I at the time, I didn't quite realize what I was doing. I realized I needed to probably leave Adelaide because there wasn't the sort of bigger business jobs there that I craved to work in towards. But I also realized I had to leave my family, right? And now I look back in hindsight and go, God, I absolutely had to get out of that environment. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done what I've done to date. But in terms of sabotage, what happened in the space of around about 15 years or so, even longer into the private equity part of my career, is I was a frustrated entrepreneur. Right? Because you remember, in private equity, we're not really doing startups. We're doing turnarounds and scale-ups. We're fixing problems of, the car crash of many entrepreneurs trying to do something creative. And I really didn't properly start a business until I launched my podcast, which was around that sort of 2018, 29 period. But I did that because I learned a lot about myself through some various events we can get into, which then makes me look back and said I sabotaged that. But then everything that happened after that, I wasn't really living congruently to who I am now, purpose, values, all those things.
Interesting. So, okay, so that took you 25 years or whatever it was to actually realize what happened back in the early 90s.
Yeah, because what happened, and I'll share this because it's sort of formative now when I look at it, is my father left our family when I was 2. And I didn't know much about him. And there's the whole character assassination stuff that happens when husband and wife split up. And my grandfather raised me pretty much in terms of the male influence in my life. My mum was around and she'd got remarried a couple of times, but I very much respected my grandfather. He was not an entrepreneur as such, partly because he had his first heart attack in his early 40s and he took a very safe kind of government job. But I could tell that it was not really him, but he had to do it because he was always worried that he was going to die from another heart attack. So he was the influence leading up to all this, okay? And literally when I was in my 30s, mid-30s, just before my first daughter was born, my father comes back into my life, right? So we're talking a period of 30-odd years. And at that time, I've climbed the corporate ladder. I'm in private equity at this point. I've done some pretty cool stuff. But I meet him and I find out who he is, right? And he was a very successful entrepreneur and had a business that was worth in the millions in his 40s. He lost that in a terrorist bombing in Melbourne, the Turkish consulate bombing, which was, I forget the year, but I think it was the 80s or something. And then he had to restart again. He started another business in his late 40s, early 50s, which again became a 7-figure business. And I didn't know any of this. So I meet him, spend some time with him, realize that I'm this kind of frustrated entrepreneur and have been for many, many years. And I'm towing the line of control and governance in these corporate worlds, but I'm really a rebel, right? Or more rebellious. And so my dad comes back into my life. We get on really well. And then he passes away super quick because of cancer. And it's at that point, with a few other things going on, that I decide to change everything. And that's when I started the podcast, and that's when I started to start I've got a number of businesses now, Dan, but I lent into this thing that I'd been repressing, hence sabotaged, when I was way back in my sort of late teens, early 20s.
So there's this two formative bookends of this 25-year period. The sort of start of the arc where you sabotaged it, you didn't realize you sabotaged. You were perhaps listening to people who had perhaps what they thought was the best advice for you.
Indeed.
But was ultimately kind of undermined that situation. Again, I'm just curious, you sat in your, what was it, the Laser, and...
bright orange Ford Laser. We're talking 80s, 90s stuff here, man. Bad.
Well, if you're not, hopefully you've still got that car, but if not, Christmas is coming up. The bright orange Ford Laser. And so you sat in this bright orange Ford Laser. I'm going to keep saying it.
That's right.
I'm just wanting to know what's in your mind as this 80. Well, how old are you? Is it early 20s? Was it?
So I'm at this time 21, let's say, around that sort of age, 22. I had my business for about 3 years before I sold it, and it was what we call an asset sale. Now I really just sold the brand and the customer list to another group of personal trainers that were starting to form at that time.
So you've had this sort of in a period of 18 through 21 where you're a bit of a superstar, you're in this kind of cutting edge world, you're making things move, but then it changes and you're then out of there. And as you're sort of driving the Laser away from the sort of explosion of the Death Star kind of thing off to Sydney. What was going through your mind? You sat in the wheel, and what was Nick in the early 90s? Nick has taken a swerve in his career. What was going through your mind then?
Well, one of the things I had, and I always have had, is a reasonably strong level of self-belief. So I felt like I'm going to go to Sydney and I'm going to absolutely make this work. So there was even now I can remember, I didn't have any real doubts about that because I had a certain number of skills that I developed over the course of the last decade, excuse me, which had allowed me to be able to understand people, to build a business from nothing. I pretty good at marketing and sales. I'd studied it as well. And here's the real thing that served me all the way through is when I was working with those high net worth clients, the ones that could afford and understood what personal training was, they happened to be extremely connected. So when I got to Sydney, I had a number of introductions already lined up that when I closed the business down and told my clients I was leaving, they were very grateful for what I'd helped them do. And they're like, how can we help you next? And so the way that I got to Rupert Murdoch was through one of my high net worth personal training clients. Now that wasn't a certainty. So when I turned up to Sydney, I had to take a couple of other jobs in the process of getting, a big job. But that only took 6 weeks and I had enough money pretty much to survive for that long. So there was a point, Dan, where had I not got this job with Rupert Murdoch and Men's Health magazine and a few other things, I would have been possibly jumping back in that Ford Laser and heading back into the remnants of the Death Star, to use your terms.
Wow. So you kind of, it was a relatively high risk strategy then. So you kind of, you got a network and you were off and you kind of out of there and you kind of broke out of that environment and you were into the, perhaps back into the Death Star actually, but you went into this private equity world. So what is private equity for those that don't know? So you've left your personal training business. You've got out of the family environment. You're out in Sydney. And you're in this corporate world now with Rupert Murdoch and this sort of media and private equity. What's private equity and what was that world like?
So just for perspective here, I was in the corporate world for a number of years before I moved into private equity. So I was working for some large corporates, and I moved from marketing and commercial areas into corporate strategy. And corporate strategy is where you're looking at things like mergers and acquisitions. So I worked there firstly in the world of corporates, and that's what got me over to the UK actually, because I came from Sydney to the UK via that pathway. And then I had some success in that. And that's when the private equity world opens up. Now, the private equity world, there's a textbook definition and there's a real definition. I'll give you both. The textbook definition is really where you have an entity, a firm that raises funds from, as it stands, from private individuals or institutional firms, but it's a private fund. And they deploy those funds into the acquisitions of businesses. And they look to try and get a sort of a 2 to 4 times return on investment on a strategy which is called buy and build. So they buy a business which is worth something. Usually they buy low as they can. They'll do that business up, right? To use a kind of housing analogy, they'll put some extensions on it. In other words, they'll buy other businesses. And then when they sell that business 3 to 5 years later, it's worth a hell of a lot more. And it's an asset class, right? But it's also a very, very, it's got a lot of prestige, mystere, secrecy around it, because there are more millionaires and billionaires in the world of private equity than any other industry, because of the way that the numbers compound. When if we had more time, I'd get into that, but it's more academic. The real definition, and I've started to learn this in hindsight, is it's kind of like the playground of narcissists. Imagine a lot of narcissists in one playground. Imagine how much fun that would be. And I learned a lot. I mean, I had a great time, right? The money's off the charts, the things that you see and experience is off the charts. Everything's about significance, right? We talked about vanity metrics before. Like, the reason I joke about that is because my whole life was dictated by that. And it's such a performance, egocentric world that you're either in that club and you're trying to beat everyone else in that club, or you're out of that club. And it's a very thin line. So you can imagine the stress that causes to perform. And if you're in that world for a long time, you become indoctrinated in that world. It becomes part of your identity. But for me, and why I was successful in it, and I was known for doing turnarounds, fixing broken businesses, is because I had this kind of thread of almost like the opposite of being empathetic. Like, I just didn't give a shit. So I would go in there and be almost clinical in the way that I'd approach things, and I didn't care about the outcome. And I realize in hindsight now, it's because I was living this different version of who I really am that was built up from lots of different things, successful from the outside. But if you actually started to look at the foundations of all of that, which eventually come crashing down, it wasn't really something that was solid or sustainable.
Yeah, okay. So you've almost living this version of yourself that allows you to detach, allows you to perhaps be successful in this playground of narcissists, but then ends up kind of taking you, you can't sustain that because it's really too much of a gap between the real you and the
That's right.
persona.
And the other thing just to share with everyone here is that it was at that period of time, particularly when I was in the private equity world, which was sort of 2008, 9, all the way through to 2018, that sort of area. That's when I did a lot of ultra running. So I ran something like 60 odd marathons and 20 or 30 ultra marathons over that period. And I now know I don't do as much of that anymore. I still do a bit. But the reason I did that is 2 reasons. One, I was running away from this world, trying to find a way of, because when you're running an ultra marathon or any marathon or anything, you're kind of very present. It distracts you from all the other shit going on. And the other thing was that I liked the way that it was making me become this kind of almost Terminator type of personality.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's literally running away from your true self, and
but not really understanding any of that until later on.
I want to get into that. Just before we sort of get in, I want to give people a sketch of the sort of, you did some very big deals, just sort of contextualize the sort of things you were working on. What was the biggest deal you did as a private equity?
The biggest deal that I was involved in was actually the last one. And this was the turning point that made me decide not to do this anymore in the way that I was. So this was a business that was called Ascend Learning, based in the US, effectively a buy and build. It was a number of acquisitions. I think it was 10 companies in total that were all bolted together by one private equity firm with the intention of selling up the chain to a bigger private equity firm. Now, when I joined that business, I came in as the chief exec of the international part of that group. And I worked in one of the divisions, which was global fitness and wellness, of course, which I have some background in. And the whole company was doing over 500 million in turnover and a really healthy profit margin. So much so that the business sold for over $2 billion to Blackstone, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, for a 14 times multiple on EBITDA profit, which is a huge deal in anyone's books. So that's a big one. I was involved in similar sorts of deals when I was back in the media game and things like that. I worked at Getty Images for a number of years, which was a business that's been bought and sold multiple times. And one of the exits I was there was another in the billions. And then I've had many others that are in the sort of 8-figure and 9-figure range. But that Ascend Learning deal and the way that it got pulled together and eventually was successful was the thing that was the sort of straw that broke the camel's back for me, because I saw so many different behaviors from individuals in that deal that made me realize I don't want to be in this anymore. The second thing that happened is my father passed away from cancer suddenly around that time. And then the third thing is, and this is I've shared this on my podcast, I went to bed one night and I woke up at 3 a.m. and I broke the 2 teeth on the right side of my jaw from effectively grinding my teeth in my sleep. Now, before that event, I call it the teeth event or tooth event, I was not feeling good anyway. I was very stressed and my body was starting to show signs of breaking down. And then this incident happened. And about 3 to 4 weeks after that incident, I ended up going to, crazily, a Tony Robbins event in Chicago. And I cried my eyes out for about 4 days there. It's a really interesting experience if you have done it, or it's not what you expect. It wasn't what I expected.
Really?
And I made a decision at that event to quit private equity. And I came back and I didn't execute it straight away. I planned my next venture, which includes the podcast and the stuff I'm doing now. And over the course of 9 months, I implemented that strategy and left the world of private equity and haven't been back since.
Wow. So it kind of really came to a head where like you felt like you were falling to pieces, and then you literally did start falling to pieces.
I did. I lost some teeth.
Yeah, in the tooth department. Wow. So this kind of, it's really interesting. So you start to coalesce at this sort of dramatic point where it's like literally your father's passing away, your teeth are falling to bits. You've got these kind of incongruency of your values are just like not feeling it. And you're in the middle of this high pressure scenario with people, I'm assuming, if you call it a playground of narcissists, it's not that super fun necessarily at all times.
And also, I mean, the amount of money that I was supposed to take out of that deal in the end ended up not being what it was going to be because of some situations that happened around that playground. And I just got really, everything, I look at it now as a gift in the same way you probably talk about your story. I go, wow, I'm so glad these things all happened at once, because it gave me the impetus from that pit of despair moment. Right. It was pretty bad, right? Like lots of things were going on. It gave me the impetus to change. And I look back now and think, would I have been brave enough to change had I have not gone through that series of events? And I don't think I would have been.
Yeah, on this is a really interesting point, because I'm with you on that. Like, so without my blow up, call it the blow up, there was a number of threads that came through at the same time that had echoed in the past. Actually, for me, the previous 10 years, I had some issues with like burnout and some mental health stuff and, relationship stuff. And it was all kind of like individual threads. And then it all came together for me in 2017. But looking back now at that time, what is your perspective on it? You say you see it as a gift, but kind of what was in fact, there's two parts to this question. The first part, what were the things keeping you in this narcissistic, pressured world? And if I ask that question, what were the things keeping you there?
Okay, so there's a point where it becomes, we talked a little bit about identity a minute ago, right? And I think your environments and what you become comfortable in, right, starts to dictate that. mix together, what other people think about you, right? All my friends think, oh, next this private equity guy drives around in Porsches. He's got all this stuff going on. That you become addicted to that identity. Doesn't mean it's the right one for you, right? It's the same way. I read recently that there's a place in Aspen which has got more billionaires than anywhere else in the world. It's also got the highest suicide rate.
Huh.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Again, I'm just talking generally, but the point being is when you're around that environment, the pressure to compete is just off the charts. And so I stayed in that environment for such a long period of time because I don't think I knew much better. I'd spent a lot of time trying to get to that place, like the decisions in my corporate career to be able to move up the ranks, to be perceived successful in these companies, to then get the opportunity to play in the Premier League of private equity. I spent a lot of time, there's a lot of sacrifices to do that. So there's a bit like once you get to the top of the mountain, you realize it's not really where you want to be. It's not easy to then say, oh, okay, well, that was great. So that's what I mean. Like I stayed there for a long time because it was addictive and I didn't know anything better until I had to change.
Yeah, wow. So it was really the universe told you this isn't working. You got to get out of there. So this addiction to identities, I think it's quite an interesting point. I mean, you got to be careful what you wish for, they say, and I suppose that this is for me. The reason I got into bother was my ego, and that is a sense of identity, a sense of self, a sense of how I'm perceived, or what have you. And I suppose that this is something I'm kind of very aware of now, and this is very true. People do get this sense of identity, like I'm this thing, I am an entrepreneur, or I'm a private equity guy, or whatever. And that attachment to that identity can be very dangerous, or for me it was dangerous. That's what resulted in the blow up. But looking back now, what did you learn from that? I mean, so in effect, you had all this dark energy, the narcissism, the stress, the kind of high pressure, all this kind of, that's this dark energy that created your blow up, right? So that then seems to be this real divided line that was sort of, again, the catharsis of Tony Robbins brought this out and allowed you to make
was actually.
Yeah, like I mean. And it really seems really clear. So that's some forceful, powerful energy when put to good. What did you learn from going through that decade in private?
Well, the one thing I will say, as much as I make it sound like it was horrific, it was incredibly exciting. And I got to experience some amazing things. And the tools that I learned, I mean, the training you get in that world is off the charts as well. You get the best people coming and teaching you how to do negotiation and all sorts of stuff. I have the ability to turn those things on if I choose to. Whereas beforehand, I didn't have any awareness of it. It was just how I was. Right. So there is a thing here where I've understood different dimensions of how you can act and affect, to get a result. Right. So there's some great things. So I learned all of that. What I also learned is that if you try and live a lie for a long enough period of time, subconsciously, consciously, but mainly subconsciously, right? I kind of knew that I wasn't doing what I really wanted to do. Kind of knew. If I look back now, it's obvious. In the moment, it wasn't obvious. But the lesson for me is, and this is a lesson for everyone, I think, is if you're doing something right now that isn't really what you want to do, if it doesn't light you up, if it's not serving people, serving yourself, all the different things that we can get into, it's going to probably get you at some point physically, hopefully physically like it did me, or it's going to reach you at a point where it's maybe too late to make the change. Now, the gift here, the big gift, right? And I mean this 100% is, imagine if I didn't, and I'm 60 or 70, and these people who are on the tube and you see their faces and they're commuting all the time, well, they used to pre-pandemic, and you think, you hate your life, dude, right? But they stay there because it's safe. And the lesson for me is and for others is if you've got that little kind of itch that needs to be scratched and you're starting to feel it, you're best served to lean into that, even if it's just to test the water, play with it, start something, do something different, get yourself into a different environment like I did, but play with it because it might open up something which is absolutely going to be incredible for you longer term.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of courage to do that, I think. And like these patterns that play out without being bumped out, blown up. Yeah, exactly that. And I think you're right that in the 10 years' time, really thick in the weeds, it's difficult to get out of that. You mentioned about serving people. So you've kind of had this sort of dark energy, and you took a lot from it. But I imagine on a personal level, there was a lot of kind of, well, I'm assuming some soul searching, because you talked about serving people, you talked about Tony Robbins, you talked about emotion and crying, and you've got this sort of, you've kind of transitioned out of that environment. So this was 2018 time when you went to Tony Robbins.
Yeah, so 2018, I went to Tony Robbins, and it was when the deal was closing on this Ascend Learning piece. And I got some advice from a friend who was very crazy and weird at university. And I knew him in Sydney for a while as well. But then he had this marketing agency business that he sold for millions and retired when he was in his early 30s. And he was always when we were out playing pool and drinking and stuff like that, he kind of wasn't doing that stuff. And he was actually going to Tony Robbins events back then. And I called him up. And he said, do yourself a favor, you go to Tony Robbins' website and go to an event. Just go to something different that you've never done before, was his point. It didn't have to be Tony Robbins. It just happened to be. And the reason that connected was because I'd bought Tony Robbins' books before, but never read them. So there's a little bit of, there's a lot of these little serendipitous points throughout my sort of 20 or 30 years. And I thought, okay, well, there's a lesson here. And perhaps I now need to. So I got the credit card out, paid for it, and jumped on a flight. My wife was very supportive, because she was like, just go and do it. Go out there and try it. So I got there, and the point of service comes up here. So you sit there for 3 or 4 days, Tony Robbins up there with his massive head and hands and all the crazy stuff going on. And it's weird, right? Like, it's totally weird, right? People are hugging each other and high-fiving. There's all this, it's like you're in a rave. And it's all about emotional states, and you learn that over time. And he has some very interesting educational pieces that he talks about, which start to make sense. Like, your brain waves and your heart waves can connect, through things like meditation. And I saw the quote by Zig Ziglar for the first time around, if you help enough people get what they want in life, you'll have everything that you want and need in life. Now, I'd never, ever contemplated not just the quote, but the concept, which sounds weird, but I'm like, what? So if I help other people, I'm going to feel great, because there is that direct thing, when you help others, you feel good because you're making a contribution, and I can get everything else that I want in life, which is whatever you define as success. So this totally blew me away. And I'm like, what? And it was at that point in that 4 day thing in Chicago that I decided that I was going to do the podcast. Well, I decided I was going to tell my story, and I was going to put things out into the world to help people. That's what I kind of said. My wife at that time had her business going. Well, it was a blog at that point in time. It's now a business, and she was doing something similar in her space. And I thought, well, I don't like to write. I can speak forever. I'm going to try and do a podcast. I'm going to go and tell the secrets of private equity. I'm going to go and do this. And that's when I made the decision. And we joked about being cathartic before we started talking. It was a therapy thing for me, but it was also a thing for me to go out there and help people. And in the back of my mind, and I'll be honest, in the back of my mind, I thought, if I can start to get some people really listening to this, perhaps it can take me into a different direction, business-wise and work-wise. So I had that there. It wasn't like, I'm just doing this because I want to help people. I thought, I need to do something different that's going to open up a different lane of opportunity. And all of that came from this very small investment in an event called UPW by Tony Robbins. So that was the catalyst after the teeth incident.
Yeah, no. So you've got Zig Ziglar, wasn't it? What's the quote? So it's like you basically get what you want by giving people what they want. Is that,
I probably bastardized it, as I have a habit of doing, but it was if you can help enough people get what they want in life, right? You focus on helping them. It's kind of like this concept I've now studied called being a go-giver, which I again never realized, and that's interesting in its own right. But if you can focus more on that, so helping people without expectation. Now, there is a bit of a miscommunication, because it's not without expectation, right? I know that by helping someone, I'm going to feel a sense of, personal pride. So I'm doing it for a reason that's going to make me feel better. But I'm not doing it because I want that person to give me something back necessarily that's, money or more tangible. And that was the concept. I just didn't really understand that concept beforehand.
Yeah, it's funnily enough, I've got a book just sitting there. I read a lot. There's a book I've just been reading called "What's in It for Them" by Joe Polish. He's just released it.
He's a friend of mine.
It's a great book, and
I had breakfast with him in Cabo in June.
No, wait, well, there you go. Well, he's Well, a fantastic read. Dan Sullivan, who's a pal of Joe Polish from Strategic Coach, was my first guest on the podcast.
Oh, really? I love Dan. I'm about to join. I'm about to join Joe Polish's mastermind, Genius Network.
Oh, amazing! Well, do you know what I've been reading? I'm thinking, yeah. So if anybody listening, join Strategic Coach for a start, which is Dan Sullivan's company. I was actually at my coach workshop yesterday, and get into Joe Polish and his networking.
Yep. He's a great guy, and the whole Go Giver philosophy, which is an amazing book in its own right. I forget who wrote it, but Bob Berg, I think. But the whole concept is that if you want to go far and really enjoy the journey, just be that connection, connect people, help people as much as you possibly can help people, because you can't do it all the time. You've got to have some guide rails within it, but that's the thing that changed my whole trajectory.
And very much is what the ethos of my urge to do this podcast was to help people, and it's funny. I've had a few people say to me, yeah, Dan, but where's the hack? Where's the deal? Are you going to do this? Is like a thing to get into the funnel? And no, I'm just trying to cut out good vibes, and what's interesting for me is the sort of strategic byproduct out of this is A, I'm meeting really interesting people and learning a lot. B, in fact, funnily enough, I've been sort of hanging out with all these people now and actually genuinely building a little side network. And I'm kind of, it creates a sort of, I'm learning more about myself and my own story. So again, it sounds a bit highfalutin talking about one's story, but I have a bunch of experiences in my life, and actually talking about it openly is A, making me understand it better, and B, is of value. And this is a reciprocal universe, you pay it forward. And it just, I've been in more of a flow state the last 18 months since doing this than I've ever been, I think. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, and that energy then makes you more successful in other endeavors, right? Whatever you choose to do. So I've found my businesses now are my current business has quadrupled this year in 2022. And I know why, and there's very much a playbook to it, but it's been all about connections. It's all about definitely some strategic choices, but it's been about going into networks and genuinely wanting to be there, right? And when you know what you love to do as well, from a commercial and business perspective, it's easy then, and everything becomes more effortless.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. Effortless. That's what we want. There's we're dishing out kind of. It's been fantastic hearing the story. We're dishing out some great advice here, but we are edging up towards the end of our time together. And whilst we're dishing out great advice, one of the questions I love to ask my guests is. There's entrepreneurial advice all over the shop nowadays. So what advice should entrepreneurs ignore?
I think one of the things, and I'm going to share something that I initially did, which I think wasn't the right thing, but I think sometimes you've got to do it as a rite of passage. I think trying to emulate or copy someone else's path, expecting that that's going to be your path. So that doesn't mean not having coaches and mentors and getting into masterminds and all that. But I think what I tried to do initially, because I didn't quite know what I was doing, was I said, oh, that person's got what I want to be or do or whatever. So I'm just going to find out exactly what they did and map it. And around about probably 70 to 80% of that was right. But the 20 to 30% that wasn't right is something that you have to discover. And I think it's an interesting distinction between that. And when I started to maybe not overthink it and just kind of let it happen a bit more, I was more present, and there's certain things that I did around that too. Things started to become much easier and as a result, more successful. So it's this kind of concept, I suppose, a little bit of the more you resist versus surrender, the harder it can be. And I kind of think a lot of entrepreneurs love the struggle a bit too much. And maybe they need to think differently about it. And
what do you mean? How do you what do you mean by love the struggle too much?
Well, entrepreneurship is always positioned, as being this kind of, it's hard, right? You don't have to Google it very hard to say, you're choosing this, the upside's amazing potentially, but it's a hard path, right? And I kind of think, well, it doesn't have to be like that. That making it harder than it is a choice. And I say that from a couple of perspectives. When I used to go and do turnarounds in private equity, a lot of the people that I was working with who had businesses that needed turnarounds were in that mindset. And as I've started to help people in scale up predominantly, again, the main thing I help them on is their mindset. right? It's not the mechanics. It's not you need to sell more things, get more leads, and drive conversion. Yeah, that's all part of it. But unless they get their head properly in the game, and there's a whole thing around self-belief and understanding where they're heading, different things that affect their psychology, the rest of it is always a challenge.
Wow, I've just fallen in love with you, Nick, because I have a absolute sort of ongoing thing about mindset and how your psychology is your most important technology, all right? How that your kind of software running on your brain is the way that you filter all that information coming at you, all that abundant data stuff, advertising, people saying shit. How you interpret that is the thing. So the big breakthrough for me was understanding that maybe I didn't know everything. Maybe my mindset wasn't right, or my psychology needed some work. And so almost a philosophy that needed to be rebuilt for me.
That's right. And that's what I learned at Tony Robbins. So really? The funny thing about Scale Up, it used to be called Scale Up Your Business before I changed it to Scale Up with Nick Bradley. But it's a mindset podcast. It's just hidden as a business podcast, right? And here's the funny thing. Here's the paradox, right? If I'd made it a mindset podcast, no one would have listened to it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because the problem with the word mindset is it's just too overused and very.
It's got the woo-woo factor, and yeah, people don't really understand what mindset really means, right? And it's not about the ability to meditate for 5 hours a day. It's nothing to do with that. It's really about how congruent you are with your own purpose, sense of value, and from that comes confidence, to do different things. So, it does come a lot from just making sure that you have the right belief systems, right, to be able to do what you want to do. And sometimes you've got a lot of the stuff I did with the Tony Robbins and then John DeMartini and a few other people I've been involved with was breaking down patterns, mindset patterns that were formed growing up from the environment we spoke about when we first started talking.
Yeah, brilliant. I love how that sort of neatly come back to the start of our conversation, and that's exactly right. And it's funny, exactly right. I'm in my late 40s. I'm 50 next year, and I've realised I've been deprogramming a lot of stuff the last 5 years, and that's kind of opened up a more neat groove I'm slotting into. There's a much better rhythm pattern for me to just keep doing, and that's a better way of being. All right, previously the patterns were not serving me. I was successful, quotes on quotes, but it was kind of vanity metric success because ultimately it did me in. And so I think this is a really healthy thing to say. In your opening podcast for your first episode, you talked about a book, Think and Grow Rich.
Oh God, I can't remember the first episode. The first 20 episodes, I just spoke into a mic in a dark room.
Well, it was very personable. I had to listen to. I quite was interested. It was all about how you did it. I was kind of listening. I thought I kind of curious to see like your sort of motivation. But Think and Grow Rich, which I think is if you called it, go for it. Hang on, he's got it there on the shelf, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, look at that.
It stays on my little famous shelf behind me because it's such a. Again, I hadn't read this before I got into the Tony Robbins stuff. I mean, this is written back in the 1930s or maybe even before. I don't know. But it's an important entrepreneurial read. It's a mindset book, but
Yeah, I mean, and just on that particular point, it is a mindset book. Nowadays, if that was written, it would be called The Mindset or something or other or whatever. It's a mindset book. The language wasn't the same then. I think he researched it in the 1920s and it was published in 1933. But in the Great Depression,
I can't remember. I've read it multiple times. I read chapters now and then still. But the one thing you realize about that book is it looks like it's a book about getting rich in terms of money, but it's not. It's about the richness of your mind and creating abundance through different things.
So this idea of working on your mindset and your psychology, how you see the world, it's not new. It's been around for a long time. But what's interesting about that book is the fact it was born out of this economic crisis. And of course, we're going through crises every 2 minutes nowadays, it seems. So it's quite a good one to go back to and say, this isn't new, you guys. This is just the same stuff, different packaging. And it's a great way to orient yourself. So where can we find out more about you? Obviously, we're going to be subscribing immediately to the Scale Up with Nick Bradley podcast. But where else can we find about you and what you do for Scale Up?
Yeah, sure. So the podcast is, you just reminded me of how funny those first episodes are. That's so funny. But yeah, Scale Up with Nick Bradley, 301 episodes in, I think. I can't remember. Amazing fun. And to reflect on your point, Dan, about, I think with the interviews and the people I've had on that show, I've had mentoring sessions from some of the greats. It's been incredible. I think a lot of how I think about things now has been informed by doing the podcast. So it's had multiple benefits in that way. But in terms of me, so we joked about being known as the exit guy. I have various businesses, but I focus mainly on helping companies, helping founders exit their businesses now, which is the sharp end of the private equity world. So yeah, you can find out more about me at scaleupwithnickbradley.com. I tend to hang out on LinkedIn a lot. So if people want to kind of ask questions and whatever else, they can go there. I'm not really an Instagram guy. And I'm in the US all the time, jumping on stages, speaking and hanging out in mastermind groups and stuff like that. So that's where people can find me.
Fantastic. Well, I personally, I do quite fancy going to the Genius Network, me. So I'm this is Joe Polish's event.
Yeah, it's his mastermind.
Yeah, and so I'm I've got that on my little list actually after reading the book, and it's so great to meet you and to spend time with you. It is a fantastic podcast. It is packed full of really great information. I've been there's a bunch of stuff I've learned already, and I will be going back for more. No, seriously. And thank you so much today. It's been again really instructive and loads of, I think, very rich insights and thoughts and sort of depth from your story. So thanks for sharing, and I'll see everybody next time.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Do you want to get the top 5 tidbits from each episode emailed to your inbox every Friday? Yes, you do. It saves you having to go through and make notes and make a note of all the books and all the ideas that are in the podcast. We go through and we choose the top 5 we like, plus put all the links into that email. So if you just go up to honeyiblewupthebusiness.com, yes, that's honeyiblewupthebusiness.com, and just enter your email address. There's a little box, just enter it in, and we will send you that information. And it saves you having to make notes and all that. That's make your life a bit easier. And of course, if you did enjoy the episode, please consider subscribing. We are trying to help people through this. So the more people that subscribe, review, rate on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, the more people will see it and the more we can help. So help us, help other people, other entrepreneurs like you. And before I go, I've got to say big up to my company, the tech department, the company we blew up and put back together again. They're generously supporting me on this mission through the podcast. So if you guys want to have a look at a company that can really help you improve your technology, make it better so your business gets better too, boosting your sales and your profit and a bit more sanity in your life, a little less stress, then head up to thetechdept.com, the tech department. My company, give us a look. On behalf of all of us here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.